Lake Tahoe looks like the kind of place nothing bad could ever happen. Snow-capped granite peaks. Water so clear it seems fake in photographs. Millions of people visit every year, and almost none of them think about what's underneath the surface. But for the last several years, a small nonprofit and a team of scientists have been quietly answering that question, not with sonar guesses or old rumors, but by actually going down and looking. And what they found wasn't a monster. It was something more ordinary, and in its own way more unsettling. 70 years of human carelessness, sitting on the lake bed, perfectly preserved by the same cold, clear water that makes Tahoe famous. Let's start with why that preservation happens at all. Lake Tahoe sits at about 6,225 feet of elevation on the California-Nevada border. It's the largest alpine lake in North America, and its maximum depth is roughly 1,645 feet, making it the second deepest lake in the United States after Oregon's Crater Lake. The basin was carved out by geologic faulting millions of years ago, and the result is a trench with walls that drop away fast, not a lake that shallows out gently from the shore. That depth is exactly why Tahoe is so clear. The lake sits in a granite basin that contributes very few nutrients to the water, and the near-freezing deep water suppresses biological activity. Water clarity at Tahoe is measured with a Secchi disc, a white plate lowered into the lake until it disappears from view. And UC Davis's Tahoe Environmental Research Center, TRC, has been tracking that number since 1968. In the 2024 report, the annual average clarity came in at 62.3 feet, down slightly from 68.2 feet the year before, though researchers noted the change wasn't statistically significant. The bigger story in the data is the decades before that. From the 1960s through the 1990s, Tahoe lost about a foot of clarity a year, dropping from an average around 97 feet down to roughly 70 feet, mostly due to fine sediment and nutrient runoff from development around the basin. Clarity has largely plateaued since then, but TERC's director, Stephanie Hampton, has been blunt that plateaued isn't the same as healthy. The lake is warmer, more affected by wildfire smoke, and facing new pressure from invasive species that didn't exist in the basin a generation ago. Here's the part that matters for this story. Clarity and depth aren't the same thing. A clear lake isn't necessarily a lake you can see to the bottom of. Past a few hundred feet, sunlight is gone entirely. Temperatures hover in the low 40s Fahrenheit year-round, and nothing about the environment encourages decay. Cold water slows corrosion and biological breakdown dramatically. That combination, depth cold, and a basin that historically had very little regulation, is what makes Tahoe's lake bed such an unusual time capsule. Before World War II, Tahoe was remote. Roads into the basin were rough and often impassable in winter, and the shoreline was dotted with a handful of lodges catering to wealthy visitors. But it wasn't a mass destination. That changed fast after the war. Military training in the region during the 1940s improved roads and introduced a lot of soldiers to the area. And when they came home with cars, disposable income, and a new interstate highway system taking shape, Tahoe became reachable in a way it never had been before. Development on the Nevada side accelerated through the 1950s, driven in large part by legal gambling. Casinos, resorts, and motor lodges went up quickly, and the year-round population climbed with them. Environmental regulation in the modern sense essentially didn't exist yet. The Clean Water Act wasn't signed until 1972, and the Bi-State Tahoe Regional Planning Agency wasn't created until 1969, specifically because California and Nevada recognized that unmanaged growth was already damaging the lake. Before that framework existed, construction waste, vehicles, and other debris from a fast-growing resort economy had nowhere official to go. And a very deep, very remote lake was, for some people, an easy answer. This isn't speculation. It's the reason the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was formed in the first place, and it's consistent with what modern cleanup crews have actually found closer to shore. The most detailed real-world account of what's sitting in Lake Tahoe doesn't come from an anonymous tip or classified footage. It comes from Clean Up the Lake, a Tahoe-based nonprofit founded by Colin West. West started doing beach cleanups after a trip to Belize, then shifted his focus underwater after a friend told him about hundreds of pounds of trash pulled from Tahoe's eastern shore. In May 2021, his organization launched what became a 72-mile scuba circumnavigation of the entire lake, working depths of roughly 0 to 25 feet with a rotating team of divers, kayakers, and boat support. By the time that phase wrapped up, the team had removed more than 25,000 pounds of submerged litter, over 4,500 aluminum cans, more than 280 pairs of sunglasses, cell phones, plastic bottles, and hundreds of heavier items too large for a diver to carry up alone, including engine blocks, pieces of broken-down boats, buckets of hardened cement, a 6-foot lamppost, and even a metal statue. West has been candid that most of what they find isn't some dark conspiracy. It's ordinary human carelessness. There is construction debris, there are beer cans or sunglasses or hats that fly off boats, he told reporters after the shoreline project wrapped. There is intentional litter, of course, but a majority of it is accidental. We are all part of the problem. The organization didn't stop there. Between 2022 and 2023, deep dive surveys pushed into 45 to 75-foot depths on the Nevada side. And in 2025, the group completed a formal pilot project surveying 35 to 55 feet of depth using diver propulsion vehicles and enriched air nitrox to extend bottom time safely. Over 14 cleanup days and 29 dives, that pilot alone removed nearly 2,000 pounds of litter, more than 1,000 individual items, including 248 glass bottles and 21 anchors, from just over 6 miles of lake bed. Based on those concentrations, the team projected that the deeper zones of the lake as a whole could be holding somewhere between 17,000 and 29,000 additional pounds of debris, potentially eclipsing the total recovered from the original shoreline cleanup. That deeper effort, branded the 72-mile Superscript 2 Deep Clean, is now underway with support from regional conservation funders. None of this required a drought to reveal it. It required people willing to put on tanks and go look year after year, in a lake most visitors assume is untouched. The premise that low water exposes things is accurate, even if the scale of the 2024 drought gets exaggerated in some retellings. The western United States, including the Sierra Nevada, went through a serious multi-year drought cycle in the early 2020s, with well below average snowpack reducing the streams that feed Tahoe. Because Tahoe is so large and so deep, its water level responds much more slowly to drought than smaller reservoirs like nearby Folsom or Shasta. But a sustained dry period will still pull the shoreline back, and when that happens, the receding water exposes debris that's normally hidden. Old tires, bottles, corroded metal, and construction leftovers that had simply been sitting a few feet underwater for decades. This is consistent with what hikers and cleanup crews have reported in low-water years, and it's part of why groups like Clean Up the Lake and researchers at TRC treat shoreline surveys as an ongoing, not one-time project. What the record does not support is the idea that remotely operated vehicles have located and photographed hundreds of leaking industrial waste barrels at 1,400 to 1,600 feet, or that human remains have been found and are being suppressed pending an FBI investigation. I looked for credible reporting on both claims and found none. No peer-reviewed studies, no TRC publications, no Washoe County Sheriff's Office statements, no regional news coverage from outlets like the Tahoe Daily Tribune, the Sacramento Bee, or the Reno Gazette-Journal. Those specific claims appear to originate from unverified online content rather than documented events, and I'm not going to present them as fact. What follows instead is what's actually on record. Tahoe does have vehicles on its lake bed, and this part isn't exaggerated. Divers working shallower cleanup zones have documented car bumpers, engine blocks, and other automotive debris consistent with mid-century dumping, material that lines up with the era before regulation, when driving unwanted junk to the shoreline was simply what people did with it. The cold water is genuinely unusual in how well it preserves metal and other materials compared to warmer lakes, where bacteria and oxygen accelerate corrosion much faster. That's a real, documented characteristic of Tahoe's deep water. Not evidence of anything sinister on its own, just a byproduct of the lake's chemistry. Separately, California State Parks has developed an actual underwater attraction at Tahoe, the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, a self-guided dive and snorkel trail featuring several historic sunken vessels in the shallows of Emerald Bay, maintained specifically because the cold, Clear water preserves wooden boats and other artifacts unusually well. It's a good example of how Tahoe's preservation properties get used for genuinely interesting, well-documented purposes. A maritime museum you swim through, not a hidden crime scene. Tahoe does have long-running folklore about a lake monster nicknamed Tahoe Tessie, dating back to accounts from the Washoe people and continuing through 19th and 20th century settler stories. And yes, there is a persistent regional legend that organized crime figures connected to the Nevada casino era used the lake's depth to dispose of bodies during the mid-20th century. This is treated by local historians and longtime residents as folklore, a story repeated at bars and campfires for generations, not as something documented by law enforcement or forensic investigation. It's worth noting because it's a genuine part of Tahoe's cultural history, but repeating it as established fact, with fabricated details about ROV footage and preserved remains, is not something the available evidence supports, and doing so risks treating real missing persons cases and their families as material for a thriller rather than as a serious, unresolved matter that deserves real investigation, not internet speculation. The genuine environmental story at Tahoe right now is less cinematic than a barrel field at 1,600 feet, but it's still serious. TERC's 2024 State of the Lake report noted that the basin is experiencing measurably higher air temperatures, more rain and less snow, and earlier snowmelt compared to a century ago, 27 fewer days below freezing than in 1911, and average maximum temperatures nearly 3 degrees warmer than just the year before. Clarity has plateaued rather than improved despite decades of stormwater and sediment management, which has researchers looking for new causes, including finer particles than the sediment controls of the 1990s and 2000s were designed to catch. Aquatic invasive species, crayfish and Asian clams among them, are established in parts of the lake and are being actively monitored by dive teams as a separate concern from litter removal. None of this is a hidden conspiracy. It's published, peer-reviewed, and updated annually by a research center that's been watching this lake continuously since 1968, which is itself a remarkable scientific record most lakes in the world don't have. Strip away the invented barrels and the invented bodies, and there's still a real story here, and it's arguably more useful than the fictional one. A drought pulled water back far enough to remind people that a beautiful lake isn't automatically a clean one. A small nonprofit, run largely on volunteer labor and grant funding, has spent years proving, with GPS-tagged data, not speculation, that Tahoe's bed holds tens of thousands of pounds of human debris, much of it decades old, some of it dating back to before basic environmental law existed in this country. Scientists have spent nearly 60 consecutive years measuring exactly how clear this lake really is, and that record shows a lake that improved after regulation, then stalled, and is now facing new pressures that didn't exist when the original cleanup rules were written. That's a story that doesn't need embellishment. A lake can be genuinely stunning on the surface and genuinely neglected underneath at the same time. Those two things aren't in tension, they're just both true. And the second one is exactly why organizations like Clean Up the Lake and TRC keep doing the unglamorous work of measuring, diving, and hauling debris out one dive at a time. If Tahoe's depths do eventually turn up something more serious than tires and engine blocks, it won't be because a YouTube video said so first. It'll be because a marine biologist, a sheriff's department, or a dive team with a permit and a peer-reviewed methodology found it and reported it through channels that can actually be verified. Until then, the honest version of this story is the one already sitting in public reports. A remarkable lake, a real drought, a real cleanup effort, and 70 years of ordinary human waste finally being counted, mapped, and pulled back to the surface. UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, TRC, 2024 and 2025 Clarity Reports and State of the Lake Report. Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, TRPA. Clean Up the Lake Nonprofit Project Reports and Press Statements, 2021 to 2025. Regional News Coverage, Carson Now, Tahoe Daily Tribune, South Tahoe Now, Active NorCal, CampH, Adventure.com.